let's move to the other big focus we have for you this week, which is the BRICS summit that was taking place even as India was making that successful soft landing on the south pole of the moon. Now, BRICS, lots and lots of questions around it, some major developments this week, not the least of which was an expansion of BRICS. What does it all mean? Well, let's first understand some of the challenges around BRICS, especially when it comes to India. And let's start by listening to a short audio clip.
जो जहाँ पे आपको मूवमेंट नजर आती है, बंदा किस छत पे चल रहा है, कोई आ रहा है जा रहा है, उसको फाइट ठोको, उसे नहीं पता यहाँ पे क्या हो रहा है। इंशाल्लाह। तो जो जहाँ पे आपको मूवमेंट नजर आती है, बंदा किस छत पे चल रहा है, कोई आ रहा है जा रहा है, उसको फाइट ठोको, उसे नहीं पता यहाँ पे क्या हो रहा है। इंशाल्लाह। Now that was a recording of Sajid Mir, a Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorist sitting in Pakistan's Karachi in 2008 and directing the 26/11 attacks in Mumbai. India played that clip virtually in front of the entire world at the United Nations General Assembly in June this year. India was forced to do this after China blocked yet again a proposal of the UN Security Council to designate Sajid Mir a global terrorist and impose sanctions on him. It's a script which plays out again and again and again at various international fora. China blindly pursuing its anti-India and anti-West policies at the cost of just about anything, even innocent lives. Last year, Beijing blocked action by the United Nations against 2 Lashkar terrorists, including the son of the group's chief, Hafiz Saeed. Last month, Xi Jinping tried to use the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to legitimize his Belt and Road Initiative, which of course illegally runs through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. India refused to sign that particular paragraph in the joint declaration. Back in 2019, India had walked out of the world's largest trade agreement, RCEP, because of terms and conditions which leaned heavily in China's favor. But the big question today is, will India now have to worry about all of this at the BRICS grouping as well? And there are some people who will say India always had to worry about it because, let's face it, China is a very major and, in economic terms, frankly, a dominant factor at BRICS. Now, here's why this question is particularly relevant. BRICS is set to become even bigger, with the expansion of membership announced on the last day of this year's summit. 6 countries have been invited to become new members. These include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Egypt, Argentina, and Ethiopia. The new membership will be effective from January the 1st next year, but this is just the first step, with the South African President Ramaphosa saying more such expansion phases will follow. After the announcement, Prime Minister Narendra Modi welcomed the new members by saying that this was an effort to make global bodies more inclusive and representative. However, India has been pretty cautious on the issue of expanding BRICS. Delhi had earlier said that while it's open to the idea, there was a need to clarify criteria, procedures, and most importantly, principles for expanding the group. The reason for this caution is obvious. China and even Russia are looking for ways to counter the influence that America and its allies have on global bodies and institutions. Both Beijing and Moscow have been hit by sanctions imposed by the West. Now, while Russia is being targeted over the Ukraine war, China has faced action for several reasons, from spying on other countries to government excesses in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Tibet. Here's what Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin might be hoping to achieve through an expanded and powerful BRICS. They may want to showcase to the West their influence over underdeveloped countries. Moscow and Beijing may try to leverage this alleged influence to strike deals and negotiate with the USA and its allies. Xi and Putin may also try to challenge the West leadership at the United Nations and other such bodies by claiming to be the voices of the global South. Now, for India, obviously, there's a tightrope walk out here. India doesn't want to hold BRICS back, but India does have good relations with the West itself. India doesn't necessarily want to be playing to some sort of a China agenda. But at the same time, India does want a multipolar world and does want to be seen as a leader of that multipolar world
by the Global South. India has always been a champion of the Global South, all the way from the non-aligned movement days. So there are lots of pulls and pressures out here, and a bit of a tightrope walk that India is walking. And we're going to be talking to experts about this in just a short while from now. But the first and the most immediate question to ask is, will the new members of BRICS, those which have just been inducted, will they be proving or dispelling India's worst fears? Let's just take a brief look at which side of the fence each of them is on. Let's start with Saudi Arabia. Now, it has seen tension rise with the US recently over some moves by OPEC, which did benefit Russia to some extent, OPEC Plus in particular. Of course, Saudi Arabia has been an American ally in the past, so again, it's trying to do its own balancing act in some sort or the other. Meanwhile, China recently brokered the resumption of ties between Riyadh and Tehran. So that's another factor that has to be kept in mind. There have also been some differences between Saudi Arabia and USA over the question of human rights, as well as over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Amid all of this, Sino-Saudi energy ties have been soaring. A $3.6 billion deal was struck in March. So Saudi Arabia, a traditional ally of the US, has been moving somewhat more to the center and moving somewhat in the Chinese direction, but is clearly not in the China camp right now. Next, let's take a look at the United Arab Emirates, which has been unhappy with the US over its inaction when it comes to Iran, Egypt, and Syria. The Middle East power has also been growing closer to Russia since the start of the Ukraine war. And another blow to the US in the region, the UAE said it had withdrawn from the America-led combined maritime forces. But at the same time, it should be remembered that the UAE has always had very close relations with the Americans. And of course, it's also part of, for example, this new grouping that has been just set up, I2U2, which stands for Israel, India, the USA, and the UAE. So another balancing act happening out there. Now, Iran. Iran's an interesting question and an open book there. Tensions with America over its nuclear program have been exacerbated by face-offs in the Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, Tehran has been accused of supplying attack drones to Russia for use in the Ukraine. Iran also relies economically and diplomatically on China, so no real question over which side of the fence Iran actually stands. The fourth new member, Egypt. Now, it has been one of the top recipients of American aid in the past, but it is China which is now a major part of the project to build the new Egyptian capital. Egypt's dependence on the US dollar has also backfired somewhat since the Ukraine war began. Meanwhile, Russia is building Egypt's first nuclear power plant. So, balanced category, I guess. The USA's neighbor to the south, well, some distance to the south, Argentina. Now, that's another interesting case. It's battling hyperinflation, and it has been struggling to make debt repayments to the IMF, in which the US is a dominant force. Meanwhile, China has been striking yuan currency swap lifelines and a $3 billion infrastructure and lithium deals with Buenos Aires. Balancing act again. Finally, Ethiopia, which has been engaged in a confrontation with America for alleged war crimes in Tigray. Now, to gain strategic advantage, China has criticized American sanctions on Ethiopia and has also pledged reconstruction aid for war-torn areas. So all of these countries are, I would say, in the balance zone. Some of them are drifting away from America and closer to China. But does India need to worry? Not necessarily. India does have close ties with most of these new BRICS members. Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia, all are close allies of India. They've conferred their highest honors on Prime Minister Narendra Modi in recent years. But of course, there are hurdles too. Iran has accused India of making slow progress in the Chabahar port. India has also stopped buying Iranian oil due to the threat of US sanctions, but China continued to buy it. Meanwhile, in May this year, Egypt joined Saudi Arabia and China, along with some other countries, in skipping the G20 event held in Kashmir, which wasn't necessarily a good sign to New Delhi. Now, China may try and play on all of these tensions to try and ring-fence India at BRICS too. And this is more or less a given. given the chill in relations between Delhi and Beijing right now, which show no signs of easing up. This phase, of course, started with China's military aggression in Ladakh in 2020. And 19 rounds of military-level talks have been held since then to try and defuse the crisis, but progress has been limited. China is showing no signs of stepping back. The last round of discussions were held just days before the BRICS summit began, but without any concrete outcome. Now, this year's BRICS summit, the Chinese President Xi Jinping was very combative against the West. Without naming America, Xi Jinping said that a country which is obsessed with maintaining its hegemony has been going out of its way to cripple emerging markets and developing countries. He added that BRICS is not creating bloc confrontation, but will help make the international order what he called just and equitable. Xi also said that BRICS will continue to grow despite any resistance. The Russian President Vladimir Putin was also very vocal against the West, claiming that de-dollarization of economic ties between BRICS countries was irreversible and was gaining momentum. These statements essentially show the vision that Russia and China have for a bigger BRICS grouping. They would like it to be an anti-West grouping of some sort or the other. Now, at this year's summit, India may have been able to walk the tightrope and avoid a fierce confrontation with China. This is because just weeks from now, India will be hosting the G20 summit. All the original BRICS nations are part of G20. India will be looking to ensure full attendance of all G20 leaders at the summit, including Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Delhi will also be trying to get China and Russia to cooperate in G20 discussions on finalizing the post-summit declaration and other issues like that. There will also be a diplomatic attempt to try and find some sort of a middle ground on contentious issues looming over G20 like Ukraine. So it is in India's interest to try and keep that BRICS movement moving forward somewhat slowly. It may also be the reason why that expansion has taken place. So what should India do about BRICS now? The biggest responsibility on New Delhi as a senior partner is to make sure that BRICS does not end up being a rubber stamp in China's campaign to be a dominant superpower. India needs to ensure that BRICS acts like a credible voice for the global South, which is broadly the term for less developed countries. They've been in the sidelines of global decision-making and they need their place in the sun. But it has to be done in a correct and in a balanced manner. And for more on the implications on all of that, two real experts in the field, Ambassador Navdeep Suri joining us, as is Zorawar Dulet Singh, author and historian. Thank you both so much for being with us. Ambassador Suri, why don't you start off? What do you think was if the key highlight of this particular summit was the expansion of BRICS, how do you think India should react to that? Be happy about it, be unhappy about it, say there was no other choice?
My sense is, Vikram, that it's a mixed bag. We were, let me say, not particularly enthusiastic about the expansion. We wanted to make sure that we understand what the criteria are. I think what we've been able to succeed in getting is that at least the members that have been inducted, most of them are countries with whom we have very good relations, particularly Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia. What we didn't want was a situation where China is able to use the expansion to back the BRICS with its friends or worse than friends, countries on which it can exert a degree of pressure.
Zorawar, what would be your take on the BRICS summit?
See, I would say the context of today with the ongoing Great Power conflict in Europe, major crisis again in globalization, weaponization of public goods by the US. I think all this has put BRICS at a juncture where it needs to sort of take stock of where it wants to go. I think the decision that they've taken collectively is now the business as usual approach of gradually chugging along and waiting for the West to get its act together isn't working. So I think they've stepped up by broadening the membership. These states, as you know, are major commodity exporters. It also links up the decision to take these specific states will also help in de-risking the global financial system. So there's a little bit of that, not say de-dollarization, but a dollar plus system where you're going to have a critical mass or of economies that can now choose to do something else with the revenues that they get from the export. So that's happening. But I think on the whole, India would have liked to perhaps slow it down to some extent. But I think ultimately the choice is, if you want a multipolar, interconnected world, you're going to have more actors come on board with you. And I think that was the call of the time, really.
Zorawar, there's this perception that India may want to slow things down with BRICS just a little bit. Is that essentially because India doesn't want a China-dominated organization to be really, gathering too much traction? And let's face it, China, at least economically, does have a lot of weightage when it comes to BRICS. China does try to use that in other groupings as well, like SCO. So is that really the reason why India has to walk that tightrope walk? It doesn't want a China-dominated organization.
So this is one of the, I would say, impressions out there that this is a China-dominated body. But if you look at the charter of BRICS and the way decision-making occurs, it is through consensus. India has a veto power, in a sense. I mean, it's not going to use it just brazenly. It wants a constructive solution. So this is the opposite of the Bretton Woods. You had a major superpower that would get its job done because it had client states. You can't say that about the BRICS. I mean, no matter what you say about the other states other than China, they're all proud, strong, independent states, right? There may be an asymmetry of GDP, but there's enough capacity, national capacities. So I would say a BRICS, even with 10 members, will still have the basic framework. I would actually flip the question and say, why are the Chinese doing this by restraining what they could do on its own? And the reason for that is very simple. They cannot, because of a variety of reasons, have the type of influence that they have in a unilateral way. I think some of it is through lessons of the past, but also they simply don't have the soft power or the ability to project their vision of the world in a unilateral way. So they have to, in a sense, compromise. They have to be in a multilateral setting. So they're investing in this for the same reason that we are.
Right, Ambassador Suri, on the question of what I think China may have wanted or Russia would have wanted is to set up this entire organization as something which is in direct opposition to the West, right? The anti-West or the not West is what they would have probably preferred. Now, they've been able to get Iran into BRICS also, which may well want the same thing, something which is anti-West. But that has to be counterbalanced by the fact that countries like India and perhaps the UAE and Saudi Arabia aren't necessarily hostile to the West either.
So I think if you use two expressions and they are not the same. It is not anti-West. It is not the West. It's an alternate perspective on a lot of issues. And I think the reason why we've seen a fair bit of give and take during this summit is because there's a recognition amongst the 5 founding BRIC members now, you could say, or the 4, and South Africa as the 5th, that we have a unique window of opportunity over the next 2 years. This is the first time that you had India as a BRICS member taking the G20 presidency. Brazil is next, and after that is South Africa. And the fact that the 3 members of BRICS back to back for 3 years have an opportunity to shape some of the discourse in G20 and create a degree of convergence on multilateral financial institutions, on payment mechanisms, on climate finance, on a whole host of issues that matter to the global South. I think that is the perspective of not the West, that you can't have all these large organizations or select organizations dominated only by a Western perspective. There is an alternate view which matters.
Right. Zorawar, also interesting to look at what didn't happen, right? The currency, the talk of there'd be some sort of a BRICS currency, that has not happened. And clearly, relations between India and China are still being somewhat frosty. There was a meeting on the sidelines that did happen, but not some sort of a formal sit-down, detailed conversation.
Yeah. So coming to the India-China bit, I think that's a work in progress in a sense. I think both sides are trying to see if they can stabilize the border crisis, but that I don't think we should link that here. I mean, if it at some stage it may happen, might not happen, and I think both sides are holding on to their positions. They might adjust them. On the dollar bit, yes, to have a common currency, which was sort of painted as the ultimate benchmark of a non-dollar system, I think that's obviously complicated. These countries are not like the European Union, where they've ceded almost everything to a supranational authority in Brussels, which then reports to Washington, right? So these are sovereign states. They want to protect their central banks. So they will have to find different ways to create this de-risk system. Part of it is happening through trade in your local currencies, which frankly has already begun. It's just the scale will increase. Now it's actually to be interesting to be seen how Saudi Arabia, Iran, which are major commodity producers and exporters, how they will denominate their exports.
All right, last word from you, Ambassador Suri. Where does BRICS go from here?
But, I just, because it's such an important point about the BRICS currency, I think the reason it's way too early for that is that there isn't any kind of consensus at this point of time amongst the members on what form would it take. And the Chinese clearly have been pushing it because in their matrix, it would be a yuan-dominated currency, and that's something that's not acceptable to several other players. I think where we are heading is many more bilateral trading arrangements, and I think something that hasn't really caught people's attention is that India and UAE have done their first oil trade worth $62 million in our respective local currencies, and that's quite a big deal actually. And if that's the pathway where commodity trading happens, you will probably see not the de-dollarization, but at least a progressive slide down of the dollar. Where does it go from here? I think the expanded BRICS, when it meets next year, and when the meetings of the various working groups start from January, it will create new avenues for these countries. It will give more weight to the formulations that we put forth, whether in New York or in Geneva, whether in WTO or in other places. So I think there's a positive note on which I think this particular summit has ended.
All right, I'd like to thank both of you for those really, really valuable insights into what's been happening at BRICS.